Good afternoon. On today's Angry Bulletin, a Russian satellite just exploded in low Earth orbit, creating a hazard that forced the crew of the ISS to take cover inside all of their available escape capsules, including, of course, the Starliner. If crises like this happen every time the Russians have an accident in orbit, what might happen if they start destroying satellites on purpose? And meanwhile, back here on Earth, Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin are at it again, this time trying to limit the number of times Starship will be able to lift off from Cape Canaveral, hoping that the FAA will back them up. So the question is this: how can Starship possibly lift off 3 times a day if the FAA prevents them from lifting off even once a week? All of this and more coming at you on The Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to our latest Angry Bulletin. So let's have a look at this Blue Origin comment that was sent to the FAA. And by the way, this was not an unwarranted comment or an unsolicited comment because, after all, the FAA has made a public request for comments for future Starship launches from the Cape Canaveral facility. So it's within Blue Origin's rights, especially since they have a lot of facilities of Cape Canaveral anyway, to file something like this. Once again, let's see if there's any justification or validity to any of this. Now, one of their biggest concerns, supposedly, is environmental impact. Now, I want to be 100% clear that I don't think Blue Origin gives 2 shits about environmental impact. Blue Origin's stated objective is to export heavy industry and mining and other damaging activities from our planet in order to make this a cleaner place. So yeah, I guess that's environmental, but in order to accomplish such a lofty objective, well, that would require a hell of a lot of launches, certainly more than SpaceX's current application of 44 launches per year would require. So really, Blue Origin has objectives that would definitely require lots of launches, which are definitely going to have an environmental impact, so I really can't see why Starship's launches are being treated differently, because they are also using the same type of fuel, the same type of engines, staged combustion, methyl-ox propulsion. So the 2 launch providers are quite similar, but here's a difference that they point out, at least theoretically. They say that Starship Super Heavy can hold up to an unprecedented 5,200 metric tons of liquid methane for propulsion, resulting in qualified distances for safety margins that potentially overlap the operational sites of other companies, the government, and the public. Well, that's not entirely true. Starship doesn't hold 5,200 metric tons of liquid methane. That's the total amount of fuel that it carries, but that's a combined methane and liquid oxygen, not just liquid methane. Anyway, a little different, but still, I think there's a little bit of a point to be made there. Yes, an anomaly with a fully fueled Starship could indeed create an explosion, the likes of which have never been seen at Cape Canaveral before, but still, what do they have in mind to mitigate this? First of all, they want to cap the rate of Starship and Super Heavy launch, landing, and other operations, including but not limited to test firings, transport operations, and fueling, to a number that has a minimal impact on the local environment, locally operating personnel, and the local community, in consideration of all risks and impacts, including but not limited to anomaly risks, toxin and hazardous materials dispersion, road closures, and heat and noise generation. Okay, what kind of number do they have in mind there? In addition, they're calling for government investment in additional launch infrastructure that would make more launch pads available to other entities in a manner that deconflicts Starship Super Heavy operations from other launch providers at Cape Canaveral to preserve the health and safety of their personnel and assets. Okay, that's not likely to happen. I don't think the government is going to build a bunch of new launch pads in case Starship damages damages anyone's launch pads at Cape Canaveral because of Starship operations. To me, that just seems like they're calling for something that will stop Starship development altogether. Also, government investment in additional infrastructure for Cape Canaveral that would reduce the risk to other launch providers in order to preserve the health and safety of their personnel and assets by diverting traffic from the proposed action area, including but not limited to improving the Roy D. Bridges Bridge to accommodate transport of large assets. So they're calling for bridge infrastructure to be added, another massive government expense that is very unlikely to be approved. Now, also, they call for limiting super heavy operations to particular limited times to minimize and make predictable their impact on the local community, and allotting other launch providers the right of first refusal or scheduled priority for certain conflicting launch or other operational opportunities. In other words, give other launch providers the right to block a Starship launch if it interrupts their operations. I don't see that happening either. Mitigating the effects of Starship Super Heavy that would require evacuation or other operational pauses at other launch providers' launch sites through infrastructure improvements or other operational changes. Well, yeah, I see their point there. I mean, if Starship presents that serious of a threat to other launch providers' facilities, then yeah, that is going to be a problem as time goes on. But up to this point, Starship has proven to be a very reliable system. Even the first launch, which was quite cataclysmic in the amount of damage that it caused to its launch site, well, that debris didn't make it as far as Starbase, let alone any other facilities, and the Blue Origin launch facilities, together with ULA and others, are much further away from the proposed launch site for Starship than Starbase is from the current Boca Chica facilities. So even an anomaly, I doubt, would have any significant impact on nearby facilities unless we're talking about a full-fledged explosion, but so far that hasn't happened with Starship at all. Now, in addition, they want to require SpaceX and/or the government to indemnify third parties for any losses caused by or related to Starship or Super Heavy operations, including commercial disruption incurred due to the operation of Starship or Super Heavy. That, I think, is pretty justifiable, really. If Starship creates a serious enough catastrophe to where it really does interfere with other operations at Cape Canaveral, that's something that definitely needs to be paid for. However, I again don't think that Starship is really going to be that disruptive, unless, of course, it's launching 3 times a day, but we're not up to that point yet. Also, institute independent mandatory penalties for SpaceX for conducting operations not included in an active EIS or other environmental restriction, violating a launch license, or any other laws, regulation, or other rules for operating. In other words, if there is some sort of anomaly during a test flight, as always happens with SpaceX launches, they're going to get hit with additional penalties. In other words, they are trying to discourage the SpaceX method of doing things. They start development by blowing rockets up, seeing what went wrong with the test flight, and correct those problems so the next rocket doesn't blow up. And as we can see with the current performance of Falcon 9, that model works very well in the long term, but this would put penalties on SpaceX's method of development. So let's hope the FAA recognizes exactly what Blue Origin is trying to accomplish here, which is just halting Starship development so that they have a chance to catch up with New Glenn. Not that they ever could, really, but what I find to be very interesting is the fact that ULA has submitted their own comment as well, and the media doesn't seem to be recognizing that. And they have some very extensive concerns, and some of them are a little bit more justifiable. First of all, they say that SpaceX should not be allowed to conduct their own EIS environmental statement. Now, I think that this makes a great deal of sense. There's a serious conflict of of interest here, and there needs to be a number of independent agencies and independent organizations who determine what the real environmental impact of Starship is going to be on Cape Canaveral's facilities. Once again, not that ULA really cares about any of that, but they do have a point. Also, they say that the EIS must address the current and evolving Starship design and scope of operations. The EIS must acknowledge that Starship is still in its experimental stages and that SpaceX's planned operations at LC-39A have evolved and continue to evolve. Starship is the largest rocket ever built, and it currently tests at SpaceX's private base in Boca Chica. In prior test flights, SpaceX has experienced several technical accidents. Okay, we know all that. In addition, SpaceX has acknowledged that the vehicle is not meeting anticipated performance levels. As a result, SpaceX has indicated that it plans to increase the size and thrust level of the vehicle stages to address this performance shortfall. This would result in environmental and safety issues greater than those witnessed at Boca Chica. So yeah, actually I think ULA has a point there as well. The EIS should reflect every version of Starship that's coming up, not just the current version. Also, the EIS should consider the cumulative effects of SpaceX's proposed operations at KSC and Cape Canaveral Space Forces Station. Well, yeah, I think that's pretty obvious. Really, so far, I think ULA is just making sure that everyone's going to do their due diligence on this EIS. I think they would have to submit similar requirements if they were proposing anything like this, but nevertheless, how much do they really care about any of this? I think it's more to try to put some limits on how fast SpaceX develops Starship capabilities. But here's a real kicker, and when it comes right down to it, I think SpaceX is responsible for this requirement and the implications that it suggests. The EIS must evaluate SpaceX's prior compliance record and assess the potential impacts at LC-39A in light of that record. There have been a couple of occasions at Boca Chica where SpaceX has jumped the gun on what they were supposed to be doing as far as the FAA was concerned. Now, this hasn't happened recently, but it has happened, and ULA is thrilled to point this out. Quote, for example, the Commercial Space Launch Act requires that every launch be licensed. In December 2020, SpaceX requested a waiver to conduct a flight, even though it had not shown that a pressure wave could be generated by an explosion during the test would not pose a danger to the public. The FAA denied the waiver, yet SpaceX still launched its rocket. I actually remember that incident taking place, and yeah, that's something that could come back to haunt SpaceX in the future, and it's not the only example. Quote, regulations under the CSLA require the closure of the flight hazard area or the area around a launch that poses a danger to the public. SpaceX receives permission to close down Highway 4, the sole road in and out of Boca Chica, for a set number of hours per year. But as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service documented, SpaceX exceeded those limits in 2019, 2020, and 2021. Or, for instance, the Clean Water Act prohibits discharges into or building on protected wetlands without the required permits. Boca Chica sits on protected wetlands. In 2021, a Fish and Wildlife Complex refuge manager sent a letter to SpaceX expressing concerns about SpaceX's employees using refuge lands as a parking lot or building a drainage ditch on protected land. In July of 2023, SpaceX ran a full pressure test of a new flame deflector for Starship without applying for the required permit. Yeah, I remember that one as well. As I say, these violations may have flown okay in Texas, and maybe they'll work out okay in Florida as well, but they could theoretically come back to haunt SpaceX for this particular application. ULA also has a number of extensive requests when it comes to the environmental assessment, but like Blue Origin, their concern is mostly trying to slow Starship down while they attempt to catch up with their own developments, not a genuine concern for environmental issues. And by the way, the reason I've been showing you all this lunar Starship stuff is because Artemis 3 is not going to be possible without Starship, and therefore without a significant launch cadence capability for Starship. And the only way that Starship is going to be able to maintain the necessary cadence to refuel lunar Starship and get it to the moon is if Cape Canaveral allows Starship to fly from its facilities and fly a significant number of times. It will require at least 11 flights of Starship just to refuel lunar Starship and get it to the moon one time. And if they're going to carry out an unmanned test first, then Artemis 3 after that, that's 22 launches. Cape Canaveral is absolutely going to have to be involved with that, and I really doubt that NASA is going to sabotage Artemis 3 just because of the complaints from a couple of SpaceX competitors. Nevertheless, there could be some limits on how many times Starship is allowed to launch from Cape Canaveral, and some of it, unfortunately, is going to be the result of their own behavior at Boca Chica, which, although not really all that bad recently, could come back to haunt them here. But let's get on to other issues. That is to say, somebody that's really causing problems for future spaceflight, and that's the Russians. Another ancient Russian satellite has exploded in low Earth orbit. They call it a breakup, but it had to have been some sort of equipment failure that caused an explosion because hundreds of pieces of debris were created. And this debris cropped up in an area of space that was a direct threat to the International Space Station, at least at first, and the entire crew of the ISS had to evacuate to all available spacecraft for a potential evacuation. That, of course, included Starliner. 2 days ago, a Japanese company called Leo Labs that tracks space debris had this to say, quote, "Leo Labs has detected a debris-generating event in low Earth orbit. Early indications are that a non-operational Russian spacecraft, Resurs P-1, released a number of fragments between 13:05 UTC on the 26th of June and 0051 UTC on the 27th of June. We are now tracking at least 180 fragments resulting from this event. We expect this number to increase in coming days. We are actively analyzing the debris cloud to characterize it, identify a potential cause, and estimate the impact. More details to follow." And yesterday, NASA made the following announcement, quote, "Beginning around 8:45 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Wednesday, June 26th, NASA instructed crews aboard the space station to shelter in their respective spacecraft as a standard precautionary measure after it was informed of a satellite breakup at an altitude near the stations earlier Wednesday. Mission Control fortunately gave the all clear to the crew about an hour later." Now, this satellite is a defunct Russian Earth observation satellite weighing about 6 metric tons. Launched in 2013 into a sun-synchronous orbit, the spacecraft was decommissioned in late 2021 and its orbit was decaying. At the time of the incident, the altitude had decreased to about 355 kilometers, which is far too high for the atmosphere to have caused any of this, so I'm pretty sure it was some sort of internal explosion, and the spacecraft was likely to re-enter before the end of the year. Now, another possibility is that the satellite collided with something else, and that created the debris cloud. But the leading explanation is that the spacecraft itself broke apart because it was not properly passivated at the end of its mission. Passivation involves removing sources of energy, such as draining batteries and venting tanks that have been linked to past satellite breakups. So yeah, they didn't get rid of the fuel and they didn't drain the battery, so that could have caused some sort of internal explosion and the resulting debris cloud. Now, this debris is going to present a threat to just about everything in low Earth orbit for at least the next several weeks to months, perhaps even a couple of years. And in that time, if any of the debris collides with other dead satellites, well, you see where this theoretically could go, a chain reaction resulting in the destruction of many satellites and a growing threat to everything in low Earth orbit, from the ISS to all of these hundreds of Starlink satellites that Elon has put up into orbit. Once there's too much debris in low Earth orbit, there's simply no keeping your satellites safe. The more these things happen, the more dangerous things become in space, and the more impossible it's going to be for us to conduct any sort of operations beyond low Earth orbit in the future. And it gets even worse than that, because this, at least in theory, was accidental. The Russians carried out an intentional destruction of one of their own satellites in November of 2021 that created 1,800 pieces of tracked debris. If Russia does that again, it's going to continue to compound the problem, and they could make the problem much worse if they test a nuclear weapon in low Earth orbit, as Putin has recently suggested. What might the consequences of that be? Well, that's going to be the subject of a future video coming out later this week, so make sure to stay tuned. I would like to thank all of the amazing people who have supported me on PayPal and Patreon. Far too many for me to recognize in one video. I'm going to do my best to do that in the coming days, but I need to start heading to Scotland right now. I'm currently in Leicester. Hopefully I'll be in the vicinity of Edinburgh tonight, and then tomorrow I'll be heading to Aberdeen to catch a ferry up to Shetland in order to cover the upcoming RFA tests. So looking forward to bringing you all of that. In the meantime, please like, please subscribe, please consider supporting this channel, and you can find all the details on that in the description. And as always, stay angry about space.